Hello, good afternoon. I am nothing if not prompt, but I had to wait for my permission to speak, so all good. Thank you so much for joining me in what I think is the best session at Data and AI Summit for the year. You're gonna get lots and lots of technical presentations over the couple of days. What I tend to cover is more about how do you now actually go execute across your organization as you build out these great data products and services, and what are some of the best practices we see from our Databricks customers. My name is Robin Sutara. I'm the field CDO at Databricks. It's just a long way to say I spend 300 plus days on a plane, traveling around the world to help organizations figure this out and how does it actually apply to their organization. I've been with Databricks for about 3 years. I spent the first year and a half in London, covering all of Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I'm now based out of Seattle, where I cover still Europe, Middle East, and Africa, as well as all of the Americas. So I'll give you lots of examples of what I see globally so that you can start to think about your data strategy. What of these things apply? Do you have sort of these components? And if not, what are some of the best practices you might think about in applying to your organization as you get ready to do that? Does that sound like an okay plan for the afternoon? Super. Prior to Databricks, probably should give you a little bit of a caveat. I spent 23 years at Microsoft. I was Chief Data Officer of Microsoft UK. So some of the examples I'll give you are like self-inflicted war wounds that I'm still trying to recover 3 years later. But again, if it precludes you from doing those same mistakes, then it's all goodness and success. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that the pace of innovation is much, much faster than it's ever been before, right? We used to have decades between periods of change. This is a really odd place for that, isn't it? I pace, so it's gonna be weird. The pace of innovation that's happening across the ecosystem is faster than we've ever seen. I think when you think about things like the internet, PC, organizations used to have decades to figure out how were they actually gonna roll that out across their organization. Mobile devices was maybe a little faster. Pandemic caused a complete chaos for most organizations, trying to figure out how are you going to change your business models? How are you going to change your operating models? How could you make sure that the technology could support the organization in completely remote type of environments where you're trying to deliver services to the customers? Then we come back out of the pandemic, and immediately you're hit with ChatGPT and Gen AI, yes? And so for the last 18 months to 2 years, every organization is trying to figure out what does that mean. Oh, and by the way, you get a net new model every week, right? That now is a better way to do it than what you did it yesterday. So you and your organizations are in this constant state of change. The problem is your organization is in change fatigue. And so how do you think about your data strategy that allows you to keep up with the pace of innovation without creating complete chaos for everybody across your organization and the business? Most people at this summit would like to tell you that technology will solve it all for you. I will tell you that technology solves about 10% of it. The other 90%, you have to think about the people in the process across your organization and how you're going to execute against it. So a lot of what I will cover is how do you approach the people and the process part of it. I'll cover a little bit on tech, otherwise they'd fire me from Databricks, so I'll make sure to cover a little bit of it. But let's really talk about data strategy and what do we see as the best components of a data strategy. I typically know how mature an organization is if I go in and ask them, what does your data strategy look like? And they'll take out an architecture diagram and or a list of business use cases. If those are the only two components of your data strategy, there's opportunity for maturity and improving what that strategy sort of looks like. So what I'm going to do is deep dive into each of these components and sort of share with you what are some of those fundamentals of this component in your data strategy that you should think about. How do you think about business alignment? How do you actually sort of do that? How do you think about people and culture and defining democratization, governance, the platform, including ingestion, et cetera, and then how do you actually measure and track? Because most of us are being asked now for ROI. We've done a lot of fundamental investment around AI. What is the return? The CFOs are all asking, what is the return on that investment that we made 18 months ago from Gen AI? Everybody good? That sound okay? Perfect. So let's start with the business alignment. I think we talk about this a lot is, how do we align with the business? How do we start to get stakeholder buy-in? How do we sort of do that? Let me start with the why. Why do you want to have this connectivity for the business? Because most organizations don't like to go through change unless they understand why they're going through the change in the first place. It helps create clarity for why are you rolling out a net new data product or service? Why are you creating the new platform? Why are you building all this technology? If people don't understand the why and what the organization is trying to do and the outcomes they're going to get for it, it just becomes something that you're building in a centralized team and they will never use it, right? Or they will decide that the centralized team is moving too slow, so they're going to build their own, and they're going to move on. Then you're going to have more disparity and disconnection. So really helping to drive clarity. And let me give you a couple of examples, because I think public sector organizations do this really well. If you were to walk into the UK Department of Education, or you were to walk into the IRS, anybody in that organization can tell you exactly what their job is, why they're doing it, what their mission is, what their objective is, and how their role contributes to that objective. I think commercial organizations or enterprise organizations struggle with this a little bit. I think Microsoft is a great example of sometimes you have to think about changing that mission, right? So when I started in the late 90s, I'm really younger than I look, I promise, but when I started, the mission of Microsoft was a PC on every desktop. If I were to ask my 20-year-old kid what PC is, she has no idea, right? And so I think one of the things that Satya did really well was he came in and said, that mission now is irrelevant. So what should the mission of the organization be? So when he changed it to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more, everybody could then think about the transformation, the cultural change, all of those things that he was starting to implement. Why were we doing it? Why were we having to execute against those changes? I had a great opportunity to work with the Databricks people team with our chief HR officer and her leadership team just this year coming into fiscal planning. The mission of Databricks is to solve the world's toughest data problems. And so she started to look across the data products and services that our people team was creating and said, is it helping the organization deliver against that mission? Is it helping us solve the world's toughest data problems? Are we hiring some of the best talent? Are we retaining them? Are we enabling them? Right? Are we preparing them to keep up with the pace of innovation so that they can work with organizations to solve those tough data problems? So I've had a couple of organizations come in and they share sort of their data strategy, and they say, of course we're aligned with the business. We're going to modernize our legacy Oracle database. And it's sort of like, why? Right? The minute you ask sort of why, well, it's going to make us modern. We're going to be able to now do things out of the cloud. Why? Right? Because if you can't answer that why and how it ties to the organizational mission, when budgets get cut, it's the first thing that gets cut. Right? You really have to ground it in what is the objective of the organization that you're trying to deliver so that people understand the change and that you can continue to get that executive buy-in. Once you can actually align, the other caveat I should probably give here is it's not just the overall mission, but if you think about things like ethical use of AI within the organization, you also have to think about organizational ethics. Right? And what are the morals of the company? What is going to be appropriate use? It's not all legal and regulatory and legislative. Some of it is very much foundational of who your organization is and what they're going to consider as acceptable AI use versus unacceptable AI use. So think of it not just from your big mission statement that's out on your public-facing website, but really think about how are you connecting with what are the mission values, morals of the company and the organization, and tie your data strategy back into those things. The other thing is once you do that, it actually helps you get the business stakeholder buy-in. This is oftentimes where we struggle, whether it's at the very top or it's sort of your middle layers of management. If you can actually articulate with clarity the mission and the value that you're looking to drive as a result, it helps you get that C-level, executive, VP level sort of buy-in on why they need to actually hold their organization accountable for the change. Does that make sense? Does that resonate? Who in here feels like they have clarity on their mission, everything in their data strategy aligns with the mission, you could articulate every aspect of it? If it makes you feel better, nobody else in the room raised their hand either, and for most organizations, it's still a journey. It's trying to figure out how to get along on that, but I promise if you take the time to do this sort of background work, it'll help alleviate some of those pain points later. The other aspect of it, of course, is people and culture. Like I said, I do think 90% of most data strategies fail because we don't think about the people behind it. And it's not just your technical resources that are going to build the platforms for you. I'm talking about the culture of the entire organization. So every persona that you have across the business, how are you thinking about the data strategy and how it impacts them? So there's a few questions I often get asked in this space. The first is, how do we organize? How do I organize my data resources? How do I organize across the business domains to make sure that we can deliver against that? Once we've created that organization, how do we think about the operating models? Where do I transition from my data engineering in domain A to a centralized data engineering team? Or where do I do the transition between data engineering to data science? Where do my business analysts get to take over and have some level of democratization? So how do you ensure that you have clear operating models? Because if you don't, one of two things will happen. Either everybody will do everything or no one will do anything. And so how do you make sure that you have clarity on that at the very beginning? The other thing is really thinking about the standardization of change management. How are you going to integrate change management into the very operating model function you have across the organization? And part of that is clear communications, and we'll talk about some of the best practices there, as well as that innovation mindset. In the world of AI today, not every AI project is going to be successful, and so we have to start creating these cultures of allowing people to test and fail. And so not every organization has that sort of mentality. I love what Jamie Dimon said this morning, right? How do you make sure that you're creating this ecosystem that allows people to iterate against the technology and what they're looking to deliver? So let's cover organizational design first. I think for most organizations, they've gravitated toward this mesh type of approach. Let me caveat that, right? Because I think everybody loves to talk data mesh. Let me tell you what I think it means, because I think everybody has a slightly different definition. I think there are certain functions that you will want to centralize when you think about executing against your data strategy. Things like governance, right? You do not want every part of the business deciding what regulations they're going to follow, what legislation they think applies to them or not. You want governance to typically be a centralized function. I'm not talking data ownership, right? I'm not telling the centralized data teams that you now own data entry for every part of the business, but I am saying when you think about the standards, the frameworks, the enforcement of sort of that data governance, that has to be a central function. Here's where it gets a little tricky, right? When you think about how much do we want to democratize out to the business? Where do we have data capabilities and business analytical capabilities in the business that we just want to democratize to? They're mature enough that we could just let them be self-sufficient, and we only want to leverage the centralized team to enforce those standards and frameworks. So those are sort of these orange octagons, hexagons. How many sides are there? I'm not sure. Set time, what's a 6? I don't even know. So for those organizations where you have some level of maturity where it comes to data science, data engineering, business analytics, you don't want to be the bottleneck to their innovation by pulling all of those resources back into the centralized team. So if you look at their maturity and they have the capability to be able to democratize it. Let them have some level of self-sufficiency and able to do that. There will be other parts of the business or business domains that are not as mature, and that's okay, right? You don't necessarily need to grow them into some level of maturity. So how do you get that agreement on what you're going to provide as a centralized data platform as a service to those parts of the business that may not have the current maturity? For many organizations, what we're doing today is really doing a maturity assessment across those business domains to sort of say this, across the attributes of data capabilities and competencies, this is how mature those parts of the business are. And then you can start to look at it and say, where do we actually want to grow versus where are we okay just providing it as a service? And so for many, many organizations, it's not trying to get everybody democratized in the same way. It's not trying to make everybody a data scientist. It's really looking across the business and making conscious decisions as part of your data strategy. Where do you want them to be self-sufficient versus where are you going to provide it as a centralized service? And only centralize those functions where you have to have consistency across the organization. A year ago, I would have told you centralized data engineering. I'm actually finding for most organizations in these hubs that are mature, they're actually decentralized, federating out some capabilities of the data engineering. Now, the trick is, how do you now make sure that you have clear operating models so that if you have data engineering in a mature spoke and you have data engineering in the central function, where's the handoff between those two teams? How do you make sure, ignore the headings on some of this. My marketing team wasn't great on the updates, but it's fine. So essentially you would look across each of those sort of functions to say, okay, for data engineering, This is what a self-sufficient hub, these are the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities that they have to be able to actually execute and deliver. And then here are the things that the centralized data engineering team is going to provide to them to be able to build on top of. Does that make sense? The other thing is change management. I think every organization sort of asks me, what's the best methodology for change management? At Microsoft, I followed the ProSci AdCar one for the most part. That there are so many, you can't even probably read the writing. There are so many different models of change management. And I would say for many, many organizations, not even one model applies across your different business domains. For many of them, they're starting to look at how mature is that part of the business and what is the appropriate change management controls that we need to instigate. There are some consistent best practices. I think one of the things I think Microsoft really did well was that we didn't treat our transformation as a singular project. What we treated it as was an integral part of the business. So as we thought about communicating, for example, the communication methodologies, we didn't create something separate for the transformation that we were going into. We integrated into all of the existing communication rhythms that we already had. So things like an all hands from Satya Nadella would include success stories that we had or wins that we had around data transformation in a part of the business, and it was all about the outcomes that it grew and it drew, as opposed to we set up a new data warehouse today that half the organization has access to, right? We really tried not to focus on the technical, we focused on the business outcomes, and we integrated into existing rhythms. I find for many organizations, the minute you start treating it as a separate project, data then becomes the never-ending project, right? It just goes in perpetuity. They feel like you're not hitting the milestones, and that often results in shadow ITs being set up because what they see in your progress is a weight, right, as opposed to I'm actually able to deliver. So figure out how to integrate it back into those actual outcomes and successes as opposed to treating it as milestones for delivery from your migration from platform A to platform B. The other thing I think that many organizations today still continue to struggle with is that mindset of agility and being able to think about how do we iterate. Most organizations are not going to be successful with every AI or data product that you roll out into the organization. The problem is we haven't necessarily built in the change control methodologies to get the feedback loop. Right? And so I think as you think about how you connect your data products and teams back into the business, for many of them, they're thinking about actually formalizing some level of product management. Last night at dinner, I heard somebody that calls them data strategists, but it's essentially that role that exists to make sure that the business has a feedback loop back into the platform and the capabilities that you're building in the central function to be able to continue to iterate and be agile as they're being agile, creating the data products and services on top of the platform. I told you I was only going to talk about people and process, yeah, so does that make sense? Does all of that make sense? Perfect. So we talk about data democratization a lot. I think this one's really fascinating to me as well because every organization, I would argue, has a different definition of what does democratization mean. I think Ali has a definition of democratization. My definition, I think, is slightly different than Ali's definition of democratization. What I think organizations are doing that are super successful in this space is they're thinking about it by persona. How you democratize to a data scientist is going to be very different how you democratize to an analyst, very different how you democratize to a business user. So yes, technology, I think, is evolving to help you think about how to expose the data and the platform and the services and tools to those different personas. But within your organization, you have to start to look at those personas. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, when we talk about the maturity of those spokes and who's going to be self-sufficient, you have to understand by persona how mature they are, right? Your business users might be way less mature than your data scientists sitting out in a federated spoke across the organization, and that's okay. Now you can actually get very targeted when you think about things like enablement plans. How are you going to enable those business users so that that spoke can be completely self-sufficient and able to deliver? And so for many organizations, they're looking at this by business domain, and then they're defining what are the personas around that. Typically, it tends to be some level of business user. Your business user could be more granular. It could be your finance business user versus your HR business user because they might have different competencies that they need to have. But your data scientist might be very similar. So in some of these domains, you'll actually have cross-pollination, and there's some great things that happen as a result of that. One, it allows you to build out learning and enablement plans based on persona, not necessarily just by business domain. So some of it may be aggregated by business domain because, again, finance might be different than HR and what you need them to do, but your data scientists might be very similar across all, so you can create a singular enablement plan for them to be able to deliver. The other best practice is they're creating some level of community, right? Whether that's a center of excellence, a center of practice, whatever you want to call it. People have visceral reactions. How many in here are data scientists, by the way? How many are data engineering? How many are business users, executives? So look around here. If I had to build an enablement plan, right away I already have 3. And if I think about the different domains, the verticals, the industries, the responsibilities, we now start to get really, really complicated. So how do you start to think about communities that you can build that even if you're in a separate domain, there are certain commonalities that you want to be able to leverage and deliver. And so for many organizations, I think they focused originally on let's do a data 101 for everybody across the organization. But what they found is nobody then ever took that and applied it into their role. And so they had to get really more specific around that. The other thing is if you think about the things that you want to control at central, things like governance, controls, et cetera, creating communities allows you to communicate those changes across the organization. A net new legislative requirement around AI comes out, which we all know it's coming at some point. How do you start to communicate that out to the organization versus a click, click, click enablement training plan that nobody will ever read? They'll just 1.5x it and then click the test at the end to pass it and move along. How do you make sure that you're communicating that on a regular basis? The other thing is lots of organizations continue to struggle with talent. How do you find new talent in the organization? And most of the time, it's not the technical part that you struggle with, it's the domain knowledge of the business that you struggle with. But guess what? You probably have some super curious personas across your business that are playing with this stuff at home. How do you create a community that they can participate in that is now helping you identify net new capabilities across the organization that have the domain knowledge, that have the organizational knowledge that you can bring into the fold of your community and start to enable and train them and give them career opportunities? The other thing I think I see as a best practice is starting to think about how do you minimize tool choice. So, for example, who in here has their finance department using Excel? Everybody should raise your hand, yes. I have yet to ever meet a finance team that doesn't use Excel, and you will pry it from their cold, dead hands before they stop using it. The problem is they have phenomenal data inside that Excel that you can't get access to. So there's some great partners here on the expo floor who have figured out how do I create an Excel front end with a Databricks back end. Your change management in that case is almost zero because your finance team doesn't have to change anything about the way. Maybe we want to optimize processes and you really don't need to do things necessarily that way. But you're not telling them you cannot use Excel, you have to use this whole new tool set that we've built out. And so where are there opportunities like that we get so caught up in the great features and functions like Agent Bricks, which I'm super excited about, but how do we make sure that we're just helping the personas and business users across the organization not have to change everything that they're doing in every aspect and attribute? Does that make sense? Does that resonate with both people? Super. So governance is the other one I think that's really, really interesting. When I first started in governance, it was really a Word document that talked about our access control list for Active Directory, and we put it in Word, we put it in SharePoint, and then we never looked at it again. Then we had this really interesting sort of dynamic of things like GDPR, things like data ownerships, things like sovereignty, things like AI, regulatory requirements, things like I don't even know what data I have in the environment to put the access controls on. So how do we start to think about those things? Let's not even talk about master data management and data quality, which is always, I think, the bane of most people's existence, along with a common data model, which we can talk about offline. Right? So I think there's 2 best practices that I see in this space. One is, how do you actually develop a governance operating model? And then how do you use that operating model to help you create the right policies and controls? So when I say a governance operating model, this is not just your technical execution and implementation of the platform that's going to support the governance. What I am talking about is, do you have representation from legal? Do you have representation from compliance? Do you have representation from the business? Do you have representation from your CISO? Who here has been blocked on an AI project by your CISO? They're CISOs, I apologize. I know you're not totally bad people, but they're trying to minimize the risk for the organization, right? And so that is very much converse to the business who wants to innovate as much as possible. So getting them both to participate in the operating model allows you to reach some level of agreement on what are the policies and principles that we're going to apply for the risk appetite we have as a company. So don't cut off all AI, but let's not have the Wild West either and everybody's doing exactly what they want. So get them both into that steer code so that you can start to agree on that operating model to be able to deliver against that. The other thing is, how do you think about what policies and access controls that you need? I'm going to do a quick plug for our field CISO team here at Databricks. They have done a phenomenal job, and we'll share these slides so that you can get to the link. But they have an Databricks security framework, which is essentially the 66 factors, or risk factors when you think about AI. It is a great starting point to bring to that steering committee and go through those factors to say which of these apply to our organization, and because not all 66 will apply, which of these apply to our organization that we really want to enforce, and how do we reach an agreement or a mutual beneficial agreement on those, and which ones just don't apply to our organization, so that every time the CISO reads a new paper about a risk, you're not now having to start all over. So creating the principles and those policies up front. And like I said, I have to talk about platforms, so I cheated and I crammed all three of those components into one. But there's just a couple of best practices that lots of organizations are sort of starting to think about. Many organizations are thinking about how do we simplify the platform, right? Over time, I think lots of legacy organizations, and Microsoft had this issue. I remember we tried to consolidate the data platform. The very first thing everybody did was download the customer database to access under their desk, right? Then for the next 2 years, I chased Cat5 cable trying to find all these access databases that existed across the infrastructure. So many organizations are just trying to get their arms around what do we have in the organization, where does it exist, how many copies of it do we have, how do we start to simplify and centralize that? So not necessarily getting to a single tool, but how do we really start to get our arms around what data do we have, and how do we start to mitigate the number of copies of that data that we have going across the organization. The other, I think, is technical debt is very real. So I worked at Microsoft when Azure first came out. I remember everybody freaking out to go from on-prem to the cloud. I think some organizations are still struggling with that journey. But for many organizations, what they did was they essentially just migrated, right? You just did a migration from on-prem to the cloud. The problem is you brought all your technical debt from on-prem to the cloud, right? And so now you're paying for your technical debt. It's just OpEx instead of CapEx. So now how do we start to think about really modernizing and reducing the amount of debt that you have? Tomorrow you'll hear some great announcements around some of the migration tools with the Blade Bridge acquisition, et cetera, where we have some tooling that will be able to help you now not just do the code conversion, but understand the business logic behind some of that technical debt, because that's the big problem, is trying to figure out what the heck does that machine do, right? We just don't touch it. There's a little Post-it note on it. Don't unplug it. But now how do we actually really start to understand what it is? Where can we actually start to automate process? I think this is the other big one is, particularly as we think about data engineering, there are some complex pipelines that we have overly made complex. I met with an organization yesterday who was telling me that they recopy their data. It's a bank, I think. They recopy their data every day because that's the process. They've always done it that way, and now they're worried about scale. I said, no wonder you're worried about scale. I have never seen anybody replicate process their data every day, every morning. So where are there opportunities for you to reevaluate processes? Because based on technology 10 years ago, that's how you did it. Is there a way that you can optimize some of that today to mitigate that? And then, how do you avoid lock-in? Moving it from one proprietary system to another isn't going to help you in the long run. Particularly, I think a great example of this is like AI models. Even Ali referred to it this morning. The model that's great today is probably not going to be the best one next week. And so how do we really think about your platform being able to support the evolution and pace of technology without having to bring the entire business down as it continues to change and evolve? So how do you make sure you're creating it as not plug and play? Do you guys even know what plug and play is? Probably not. How do you create it as open as possible so that you can do that? And then I'm going to wrap up with one more slide, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions, but the other thing I get asked often is, what are some best practices around measurement and tracking? How should we think about that? I think the first thing is, people love to measure KPIs. When I first stepped into Azure data engineering as the chief operating officer, the first thing I did was look at the KPI dashboard. It was 700 KPIs. So when I went to each team to say, which of these KPIs matter to you? Like, none of them. I'm not looking at any of them, right? Because there were just so many, they were inundated. So it took a lot of negotiation back with Scott Guthrie and sort of Jason Zander at the time to say, which one of these really matter? And it's not like I'm locking you in, Jason, forever, but which one should I really focus the team on trying to solve for, or which one should we focus on for this quarter, for this half, whatever the period of time is. And really, it's not that you're not going to look at the other 695, but I want 5 of them that we can really say, we're going to put measurable improvement metrics around these 5 KPIs. The other thing is, think about not just the monetary. I think AI is really sort of creating this weird ecosystem where CFOs are saying, we did this big investment 18 months ago into AI, and now what's the return on that investment? What money are you making the company? It tends to be monetary, right? They want to see some monetary value, but I'm seeing more and more organizations create not just monetary value, but also cultural value. Are you improving work-life balance for your employees? Are you, creating processes so that they're not inundated with sort of the mundane tasks, and they're now able to actually create net new products or services for your customers? In that case, you also have to think about checkpoint metrics, because like I said, 9 out of 10 projects are likely going to fail. At what point do you de-invest? Do you stop investing? I think lots of organizations right now are sort of struggling with that. Where do we stop investing in this AI project or this data project or product so that we can reinvest in a new innovation, right, or a new capability? And so establish those checkpoints up front, because if you wait until the end, everybody will point to the one metric that was not good and say that's why we failed, right, or that's why we shouldn't have invested in that resource. So at the very beginning of these data products and AI projects, really establish what those metrics, how you're going to measure success and where you're going to start to de-invest. That's why in Azure Data, I had 27 products, right? We never de-invested in anything. And so it really doesn't help you scale with the limited number of resources if you have everybody distributed so much to be able to deliver. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of the summit.